imagine a world where not necessarily that you are squeezing more meetings in a given day, but you're able to follow up faster and you're able to do that in a way that's more personalized and you're able to actually input the right data into your CRM and drive consistency around that across your team such that you have an indicator of what is the deal I should be working right now.
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. Ken, well, great to meet you, and thanks so much for joining us on the RevOps Champions podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ken Babcock, co-founder and CEO of Tango. Ken, why don't you maybe tell us quick for the folks who don't yet know Tango, what does Tango do?
Yeah, well, we've done a few different things over the course of our life. We started the company about 5 years ago. We are historically known as the easiest way to create documentation of your internal tools and processes. So we are a browser extension. We live in the browser. We overlay on top of your tools and allow you to create documentation, step-by-step how-to guides in the flow of work. So all it takes is you turning on the extension, going through your process, and then out spits something that typically would have taken you about 4 hours, and we spit it out in about 30 seconds. So we started there. We then were able to take that documentation and turn it into interactive walkthroughs. So think of you being the creator, but then sending it to somebody to follow that process and basically Tango taking over their screen, showing them exactly where to click, exactly what to do and what to follow. And what's interesting in building those two products, we realized that over the 4 million plus workflows that we've seen captured on Tango, there's a lot of just navigational clicking, drop downs, submissions, stuff that we could handle ourselves and potentially automate. And so we recently launched our first AI agent. So now all those inputs, the documentation, the walkthroughs, that feeds into an agent that allows you to actually what we call hybrid automation. So take over a process, take the 25 steps that it normally takes, distill those down to like 3 human steps that actually require some context and decision making and driving a lot of efficiency. So that's always kind of been the plan. That we call it the crawl, walk, run of Tango: documentation, walkthroughs, agentic workflows. We're just lucky that a lot of the tech and AI has kind of met this moment.
It sounds really cool. And when we were connected a few weeks ago and sort of leading up to our conversation today, I was asking around our team, because I've never used Tango, and I'm like, oh, does anyone know what Tango is? And it's like, oh, yeah, Cecily uses it and Daniel uses it and Henry uses it. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe it's something we should learn more about. And then, of course, we know that our good friend Mark Hans just joined your team recently. So I'm pretty sure we're going to be learning more about it, whether we want to or not.
Yeah, you're going to want to. It's going to be good.
That sounds awesome. And as you were talking, so we run on EOS, the entrepreneur operating system. And I know that your history is you've worked for some really big companies who don't typically use EOS, but you probably use some other kind of business operating system. And as a visionary CEO myself, it took me way too long to understand the value of process and how powerful process is. And it can actually become something that you love, even though it's not something that comes naturally. And so thinking about the EOS world, which there are, I don't know how many thousand companies around the world running on EOS, but you would think for all the companies, no matter what the industry is that are listening in and are familiar with the book by Mike Payton, Cold Process, which is written specifically for companies running on EOS, this seems like a really sweet fit. Are you familiar with EOS, and would you say the process is very central to what it is that you're solving for?
100%. There's another book I'll throw out there, Traction, which I think is the author of EOS. It's on my bookshelf behind me, actually.
Yeah, it's on mine too.
There we go. Yeah, process is kind of this bedrock foundation that allows you to kind of innovate at the edges. And so I was lucky. Yes, I worked for some big companies, Uber, when we were going through this great crazy growth trajectory. But process for us was actually a way to drive consistency on the things that we wanted to be consistent. We had tested and we had understood, okay, these are the processes. We don't necessarily need these to change. And that allowed us to focus a lot of our creative energy on the stuff that we really needed to figure out. And so I think sometimes process can get this bad rap of like, oh yeah, process. It's boring, it's steady, it's consistent, it's step by step, it's programmatic, totally, but it's not everything that you do, right? And so I think it gives people like us who are in this sort of CEO position, but also companies that are trying to stay creative and strategic, it gives them more headspace to be able to do that. Well, I think what was unique about Uber is when people came into the company, it was well understood that you just needed to go execute on a lot of things. And the ambiguous problems that would hit you daily, like that's the stuff that you needed your creative energy for. And so everything else we built process around, which I think, aligns really well with EOS.
And then, I mean, are you currently sort of targeting any specific industry or business size?
Yeah, so we are focusing in on sales teams. So RevOps obviously is one that we have come to understand really well. And I'll explain that. So I mentioned that Tango started as a documentation tool, evolved into a walkthroughs sort of digital adoption. I would kind of equate that to. We were historically always very horizontal, meaning anybody could come to us and book a demo. Anybody could download the extension and probably find a use case out of it. Documentation sort of exists everywhere, which I think was a blessing for us because early on that allowed us to get a lot of feedback really quickly. Feedback directly from the customer, but also feedback through data. And what we saw in the data was that majority of our workflows were being created on CRMs and things adjacent to CRMs. And if you think about it, it makes complete sense. Critical tool, lots of widgets, lots of process, typically non-technical end users on the other side, and non-technical end users who like their primary job is not CRM admin, right? And so we kind of took those learnings and we said, okay, hey, we've got 5 years of data, 5 years of understanding. We also have Salesforce and HubSpot as investors. I think this is very good timing for us to narrow the focus and provide a solution that's really going to meet the needs of the folks that are finding us already organically, but maybe want us to do a little bit more, or maybe want us to focus a little bit more on their tech stack or enable certain functionality and features. And so the benefit of focusing in that ICP is that we're going to be able to do that with this new product.
Very cool. There's a program that HubSpot is running where they match solutions partners and app partners. Are you already involved in that?
We're backed by HubSpot. So we are involved with that. We're also involved with the HubSpot partner ecosystem, which has been hugely valuable for us. We're getting sort of firsthand perspective from these partners on how to work with clients, how to implement, what their challenges are. And so it's just another perspective that kind of rounds everything out.
And then sort of back to, so you said that, sales teams are really your focus currently. And then you mentioned the adjacency to CRM and CRMs, there are a lot of options for salespeople. And obviously the easier we can make it for them, the more productive they're going to be, which is good for everybody. Does it matter the size of the team, or are you focused on a particular size team?
I think there's this Goldilocks zone. If the team is small enough, you probably don't have a ton of complexity yet. You're on the precipice, but you probably don't yet. The larger teams you end up having more robust RevOps teams. You have probably people dedicated to like a CRM admin role. And I think there's a lot we can do to help create leverage for those people for sure. The in between, the Goldilocks zone. So think about sales teams between, call it like 10 and 500. That's like kind of a nice Goldilocks zone where maybe the RevOps team isn't so robust yet. Maybe they're thinking about hiring a CRM admin, but they come across a product like Tango and they say, oh, actually, we can defer that headcount for now, use a tool like Tango. So that we're sort of somewhere in the middle.
That is a Goldilocks. That's a good market. So you've mentioned RevOps now a couple of times. Do you have a RevOps team yourselves?
It's interesting. We do, but we also use Tango internally. So we've actually created a lot of leverage. We have a RevOps person. And so they use Tango right on top of our HubSpot instance. on top of our other tools, our call recorders, everything. And that basically allows sales reps to focus on building relationships, which is really what we want them to be doing. We don't want them mired in admin tasks. I think there's a stat out there that sales reps, and I believe this comes from like the state of sales from Salesforce, sales reps spend like 65% of their time in admin work. And that's a broad bucket, sort of non-meeting, non-customer work. But we feel like that ratio is just off. And so we're constantly trying to tip the scales on that for our team.
A quick plug for HubSpot on that one. They don't spend quite as much time as that. I mean, the ones that are using the HubSpot CRM. But the point is, any increase in productivity by a few percentage points or 5 or 10% could make a massive difference in all kinds of ways, right? I guess for the folks listening who might not be all that familiar with sort of the RevOps function, or revenue operations, of course, is what it's an abbreviation of. I guess what I'm hearing, of course, is Tango is essentially a sales enablement and productivity enablement tool, which, of course, that is the purpose of RevOps in an organization, is how do you enable your customer-facing teams, typically marketing, sales, and customer service, to be more effective. So you're saying that essentially Tango is very much is a product that is enabling that even further and driving that productivity even more than was possible before.
Yeah, 100%. And like you said, it probably doesn't just touch sales teams. I think there's kind of this trend of RevOps also maybe being called go-to-market operations, supporting marketing. The way we like to think about it, because I think productivity sometimes makes it feel like, oh, okay, you can get more hours out of your day. But the way we really think about it is accelerating your revenue. So if you look at a given deal, and you probably have a sales cycle and you probably manage towards that, maybe it's 60 to 90 days. When you really start breaking that down and dissecting it and understanding like what contributes to that 60 to 90 day cycle time, it's probably for the rep that's working that deal, just a lot of competing priorities, including a lot of which is that admin work I mentioned. So imagine a world where not necessarily that you are squeezing more meetings in a given day, but you're able to follow up faster and you're able to do that in a way that's more personalized, and you're able to actually input the right data into your CRM and drive consistency around that across your team, such that you have an indicator of what is the deal I should be working right now? What deal is in need of a follow-up? Where am I lacking information, as opposed to in that moment there where you're entering the CRM, it's like, well, I don't have this info, but maybe I'll put a placeholder. And then when I come back to it, I forget if the placeholder's real or I need to seek that information out. And so I think there's a lot of downstream impacts of lifting that administrative burden off of teams. And the biggest I'll call it a lagging indicator, but biggest outcome is that you're able to accelerate that revenue. And so when we talk to sales leaders, that is really the thing that they anchor on, is like, oh man, if I'm able to lift that administrative burden, it's not necessarily that I need less salespeople or I can book more meetings in a given day, because there's other factors at play when that happens, but it's actually, oh, we can move faster and we can move on these deals faster and we can spend more time with the customers to earn their trust and build out the business case and strategically analyze an account. And that becomes really powerful when you think about, hey, if this admin stuff wasn't in our way, what could we be doing?
Sure. Yeah, I totally get it. And one of the things you mentioned there, and we, do you know Sangram Vajre from GTM Partners? Okay, so we had him on the show a few months ago as well, and they have their own model, their sort of go-to-market model. And RevOps is one of the components of go-to-market. And we've had a few other guests on the show too who decided actually they want to play in the go-to-market space, whereas we've decided that actually RevOps is more than enough for us to do, because for us to be a strategic advisor to the entire go-to-market team, which starts typically with a CEO of a company, it's just too broad a scope for us. So for us, it's more, we're staying more focused on RevOps, which essentially is all the stuff that you're talking about, is like enabling and making it easier for the humans who are delivering all the customer experience. And also, to be fair, it's really providing the best possible employee experience for those humans who, again, are the customer, whether they're sales or marketing or service. It's really just supporting what they're doing. I think we're quite comfortable staying in the RevOps component of go-to-market because it's a very important connector for anyone who's trying to learn more about the future of your go-to-market for your business. I would recommend checking out go-to-market partners because that's essentially what they do is they're doing all the research on how go-to-market is changing. And of course, we all know it's changing pretty dramatically right now with AI, which brings me to sort of my next question. So you guys were founded in 2020, is that correct? And I'm guessing when you first started, you were not tango.ai.
No, we were not. We've owned that domain for a while, but our first domain was tango.us. I think like AI in general, obviously has captured a lot of the public headspace in the last 2 years, or I mean, I would even say going back to 2023. But I think for us, fundamentally, we knew we would head down this path because ultimately creating a documentation product that then gets sort of reinforced through end user walkthroughs and their ability to replicate that process. It's a really valuable set of data that you can do some pretty powerful things. And so in 2020, we probably weren't calling it AI per se, or even agents.
Mm-hmm.
But what we were saying was, could we act on a user's behalf? Could we coach a user on what they should be doing? And so we're just lucky that a lot of the foundational model companies made as much progress as they did because that allowed us to accelerate our roadmap.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. So Ken, let's zoom out a little bit because you've got a lot of really cool experience that I think you could share. You mentioned Uber earlier, which must have been one heck of a ride. Sorry, that was an unintended pun.
I was just going to say.
From your perspective, so you've seen like scale very few other people have seen, right? Being part of an organization like Uber, for better or for worse, the scale is, there are very few companies that have scaled as effectively as Uber has. What, in your mind, is what differentiates companies that scale versus those who don't, even if they're seemingly in the same market or space?
There's a million factors. So even to distill it to one is sort of a difficult exercise. But what I will say is I'll call back to what we were talking about around process. The team that I was hired into initially was focused on building the playbook for every market that we launched in. And ideally, that playbook was a reflection of the learnings that we gathered along the way. So I joined and we were in about maybe 150 cities. We would eventually grow to 700 markets. And so the idea was you take the learnings from 150 and that becomes the playbook for the next 550, but incrementally you're adjusting along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that meant documenting process, creating dashboards, creating metrics, tactics, different strategies, different like remediation plans for a marketplace. And the reason we needed that is because when we launched a market, we went in and we hired brand new people. We had some folks who kind of were in this launcher role where they went market to market just to like be there for a month and provide context, but we hired everybody fresh. And the expectation was that they hit the ground running really quickly. And the only way to do that was having the playbook, having the processes documented. And it was well understood when you came into Uber that, like we talked about, your job was to execute on the processes and innovate on the fringes. And so we had really highly qualified people coming into Uber. It was a super hot company. Everybody wanted to work there.
Uh-huh.
Pedigrees like you wouldn't believe. But even so, the well understood expectation was that you were an executor. And that was what was valued at the company level, that was valued in the cultural norms. That's what we sort of put on a pedestal internally, was people that executed really well.
Mm-hmm.
And so you did not have a bunch of Stanford MBAs, Harvard MBAs strategizing and whiteboarding. It was like, no, we're just going to go do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as new problems come up, then we'll figure it out. And so I think for scaling and the way we did it was just well understood what everyone needed to do. I think when you scale rapidly, you lose sight of what is this role? What are the responsibilities? What do we expect someone to do? We never lacked that clarity. The first year I was there, we went from 800 people globally to 5,000. And even along that journey, it was extremely clear what we needed people to do. And the culture was aligned to that.
Yeah. it sounds like to do that, the culture is absolutely foundational, right? So that has to be built into the culture and the values of the organization. Leadership at every level there's that constant drumbeat of this is who we are, this is what we're doing, right? So would you agree that ultimately that was the foundational piece, was the culture, and part of the process, of course, and the execution is repeating, this is who we are, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it.
Yeah. And there's always the risk of saying the culture at Uber is why we were successful, because the culture was also pretty well documented that it was a difficult place to work. I think there's two elements of culture. I think there's sort of how we operate and how we behave. Uber was exceptional at how we operate. So like I said, roles and responsibilities, what we need out of the business, metrics, a lot of the stuff we talk about in the entrepreneurial operating system. But then the behavior and the willingness to cut corners in some situations and the sort of brazen attitude, I would say that was not a component of the success. In a lot of ways, like, we succeeded in spite of ourselves on that regard, but I would be hard pressed to find another company that operated at the level that we did back then.
Yeah, I can imagine. So once you have sort of that foundation of the, like, sort of the culture and I mean, and then of course, and leadership, you cannot do that without really strong leadership, right? To maintain that culture. What would you say is kind of the next foundational level? Well, I guess what you're saying is the next foundational level is the process, right? This is our vision, our strategy now, and this is the plan on how we're gonna operate, how we're gonna execute.
Yeah, 100%. I think connecting the dots from, like, at the highest level, the 30,000 foot view, to what's happening on the ground, there's a lot of companies that don't build that connective tissue. And so I think it's really important that you're aligned all the way through. Process is a huge component of that. Like you said, sort of that second degree leadership, or not just the top down piece, but like then the next layer, buying into that. I also think too, like, something that's also really powerful is just having everyone believe in the mission and vision. Everyone saw the mission and vision at Uber, and what we were doing. And I think there was actually some freedom to sort of define that based on what you cared about. I mean, we were moving people around cities, in a way that they hadn't before. And in some markets, we were creating equity in terms of, like, who was able to actually move around a city. In some places, we were actually helping, like, reduce emissions. I mean, it was a pretty interesting multi-pronged value proposition. And so a lot of people could rally around that. So it wasn't just, okay, here's what I need to do, here's the strategy, but I'm also bought in.
Assuming any organization has that strong culture, leadership, mission, vision, and they know how to keep communicating that, which I think is obviously we should probably mention the communication of that is critical and that it's frequent. Assuming that folks have all their processes they're figured out, how many different core processes do you have? Even if they're on a spreadsheet, that's kind of the next level. How do you then take that? So we've got all our processes figured out. We know that they're iterative because processes are typically built out in the sort of the 2080, which is just get the process 20% done, and then we'll get to 80% over time, because as growth happens and you add people and you add data, things are going to change, and we need to change and iterate processes. How do you then, I guess, go to the next step? How do you then make that move faster?
It's accountability, it's metrics. So understanding what those processes should drive, right? And so I think, to your point on iteration, we need to iterate in the spirit of driving a KPI, driving a metric, right? If we're just iterating for the sake of iterating, you're just going to be spinning your wheels. And so I think the next step from that is, like, what are we aiming to drive with these processes? And, like, what do we expect to see in these metrics if we are iterating, if we are improving? That's a big one.
Okay. So once you figured out this, call it that, the data component, right? So the metrics, KPIs at a high level. So each team, marketing knows what their metrics or KPIs are, how that hands off to sales, and then sales to service. I guess within those teams, people have sort of their individual metrics of what winning looks like for each of them. But that, let's just call that all the sort of the data component. What comes after that to sort of drive scale further?
Reinforcing those metrics. So we had and it's funny, we have this at Tango too, and it's at the exact same time every week, Tuesday at 10 a.m. We have our company-wide all hands. So actually right after I get done with you, I jump to the all hands. But that weekly drumbeat of showcasing metrics, show how they moved over the course of the last week, highlighting people that had a direct impact on those metrics, celebrating the iteration of process. That is such a huge reinforcement lever that I think a lot of companies undervalue. So I'll talk to founders sometimes, and part of kind of like those cultural questions that, inevitably like a company-wide meeting comes up. I ask them, okay, how often do you have an all hands? Sometimes I've had founders say, oh, we do it monthly. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're missing a huge opportunity to continually reinforce what matters. And this is that communication piece that you alluded to, Brendan. It's like, I view my role as like chief repeating officer. So we're repeating the metrics, we're repeating the process, we're repeating the strategy, the vision. Like it needs to become boring for people. And if you're getting the company together monthly to do that, it's just not frequent enough and you're losing a huge opportunity. So I think once you have that in place, it's about reinforcement, it's about repeating it, it's about boring people with what matters.
So I really like the reinforcing. Do you use any particular or familiar with any particular change management frameworks? Like, for example, we use the ProSci ADKAR model here.
I've read about and heard about a bunch. I usually try to like pick and choose some good things from each of them.
So the ADKAR change management framework, which of course is so central to things that we're doing. Again, we're talking about scaling. The one thing that you cannot scale without change, right? So change management is such a critical component that I guess some leaders are well aware of and others aren't. And to your point, a lot of teams are successful despite not really being aware of how things could be easier if they use the change management framework. So ADKAR ADKAR is the acronym, and it starts with awareness and then goes to desire. But the R stands for reinforcement or reinforcing. So it's such a critical piece because change is constant. You have to keep going back and training the people who are using whatever tools, processes, you name it. Because if you're growing, you're changing. I'm guessing, just thinking about our conversation so far, it looks like, again, Tango is very much solving for a lot of the change that does continuously happen as a business scales, right?
100%. And I think part of the like reinforcement component that we've built into Tango is you can basically rely on Tango to continually walk you through that process. And there's analytics back to the creator of where people got stuck or whether they completed the process. And so you're constantly thinking about, okay, have I created something that's relevant? Have I created something that's usable? Are people understanding it? Are they accessing it? Are they viewing it? So there's a lot of different ways to understand, like, are the reinforcement efforts working?
Absolutely. It's such an important part of, again, it's that whole, I think in EOS, again, it's the traction piece, right? It's like you cannot have traction without the reinforcement and the communication that in EOS, you have your weekly L10 meetings, and that's a very deliberate reason for doing that. It is about reinforcing is one of the things, but of course it's also about managing change as it happens every week. What are the issues or opportunities we have to discuss? Okay, so assuming an organization has great culture, vision, mission, leadership, processes are well on their way and are well documented and are where people can find them and they can be used. They have clear, everybody knows what the metrics, KPIs, et cetera, are. There's that continuous reinforcement communication that happens on a weekly basis, at least. In some cases, it's daily, but at least weekly. What is the next component for a business to scale?
Well, so I think you hinted at it a little bit as you were chatting. A lot of what we described there, right? You've got a mission, a vision, a strategy, the things that are all sort of like static, done. I think it is extremely important to also acknowledge the change, right? Whether it's coming from the market, coming from the macroeconomic environment, competitors, internally, our data, because it's human nature to resist change, right? It's uncertainty. And most people aren't, I would say almost like everybody doesn't like uncertainty. And you always want to drive towards more clarity. But what I would say is like for leaders, you need to acknowledge when like the rules of engagement have changed. And so it's interesting. I'll give you an example just of like how we've done this. We have been building this business for 5 years, really strong growth. And with all the advancements in AI, the rules of engagement had changed for us. We said, hey, we've got this roadmap. We always thought we would build this thing 2026, 2027. I'll even show you some slides that we prepared at the board level that said, hey, we're going to build this in 2027. But the reality is like with all the advancements and the rapid rate of change with AI, the rules of engagement had changed. And we basically had to say, hey, everyone, we've built a great business. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but we need to accelerate because if we don't, someone else will. And not necessarily coming from a place of fear, but really just saying like, hey, we've got this. We always knew we'd have this opportunity. The opportunity is meeting us earlier than we thought, and we'd be silly not to act on it, right? And so I think that is the final piece of the puzzle is like acknowledging when the rules of engagement change, because it does kind of force you to revisit all of that, all the other stuff that we talked about. Your business fundamentally changes. I mean, we're going through that right now. And the pillars of mission, vision, strategy, purpose, process, data, we're just looking at everything a little bit differently and saying, is it still relevant to us? But that's because we acknowledged, hey, the rules of engagement have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And you started alluding to this as you were talking about change. For the business that we're in, which essentially is helping businesses use technology, which is the way we look at it as kind of the final component of driving scalability, which is weird because we have to do it for ourselves without being the shoemaker and having children. But we're also, that is our business. That's the value that we provide and create for our customers and our clients. So we're assuming that they've got everything that we've talked about so far, all the soft stuff, which we all agree is the hard stuff, right? All the people, process. Once you get into the data, metrics, et cetera, that starts getting a little easier. It's just a matter of making decisions on what that should be. But again, the other soft stuff, which doesn't have to be soft, you can make it more predictable, like from a change management and communication perspective, by using frameworks that are proven to work and that just make it easier for everybody to not reinvent the wheel every time. But the final piece, of course, that ironically, but in reality is what causes most change is technology. So the way we look at change, I get excited about change. It's not comfortable, but I believe that we have to do hard things. But I get far more excited about what's going to be better on the other side of going through a change in technology than, and what we need to do, of course, is bring our people and our teams along. It's like, if we don't make this change and don't embrace and use the technology that's being made available to us, which of course right now is all being touched by AI in one way or another, seems to be kind of the final component that really drives scalability. How do you think about that sort of the technology piece? I mean, how do you think about implementing new technology? And do you have a process around that?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, we work with a lot of customers who are on the precipice of a software rollout and they're adopting new technology. And, some of these rollouts take a while, but Tango serves as like that enablement engine to make sure that they're successful when they do roll out. So I tend to think about technology from the perspective of like, well, yes, a lot of this stuff is going to change. If you are purely reacting to the hottest new AI product out there, and I say this even as a builder of a new AI product that's readily available in the market, I would encourage this even to our customers, right? You jump on the demo with Tango, of course, we're incentivized to partner with you, but I also encourage folks to think about what are the jobs to be done? What are the things that you're trying to solve for? What are those processes? And do you have a clear use case? Because on my end, if you do, I know that you're likely to be successful with Tango. If you don't, And we can help you get there. We can help you define those. That will make you more successful at Tango. But if you're starting from a place of, oh, this looks really cool, I'm not sure how we're going to use it, but it looks really cool, that's just not going to work, right? So I think when it comes to technology, people really need to be grounded in what are the jobs to be done? What are the things that we want the technology to execute on our behalf? Because it can get very overwhelming if you're just constantly thinking about, I need to have the most modern tech stack. Well, why? What's unique or complex about your business that you need this new tool or this new widget? So that's kind of what I encourage folks to think about.
Would you say that that sort of jobs to be done? I think it's almost like it has to be a have to have versus a want to have.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be a clear need, and the jobs to be done framework, which is one of many frameworks. I think it applies to software too. We tend to think about it internally as more of a product development framework when we think about our customers and our users and their jobs to be done. But I like to flip it on its head and ask a customer to think about that. What are the things that you're looking to replace? What's on the wish list of things you could be doing? And if that's not clear, maybe we'll sell a deal, but we might not drive engagement. We might not drive a renewal or an expansion. So we need that job to be done to be very clear.
Would you say that Tango is typically part of a much bigger tech stack, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we fundamentally, because we built as a browser extension, and you can see our little Google Chrome award back there, we're a layer on top of your tools. So you're coming to us, you have a tech stack, and maybe it's underutilized, or maybe you're trying to drive adoption on something new. But we are that layer that helps you kind of like mold your tools and your systems to work in the way that you want. I think so many people, particularly sales leaders, have this idea of what their sales process is, and it's unique and it's nuanced and it's custom. A lot of times the typical revenue tech stack just doesn't conform to that, right? You're fighting tools to get it to operate in that way. And so with Tango, what we're telling people is stop fighting the tools, the underlying tools. Get Tango to be that overlay to drive a lot of the like behavior that you want to see in your sales process.
That's really interesting. I need to check it out more because in the work that we do, we see a lot of, and of course we experience it ourselves, like every business in 2025 does, which is the challenge of tech debt, right? Where you've acquired various software subscriptions over time across different teams. And then every now and again, you have to do an audit, or like in our case, we have someone doing an ongoing audit that's reported quarterly of where is there overlap between tools that we've acquired over the last year or two or more. Do you think that Tango will potentially help avoid tech debt?
I maybe would reframe it differently. So, I mean, yes, there's tons of bloat in software. I think Tango can allow you to basically have more of a platform across your tools and process, because we're also able to connect tools. So most of the workflows that we see created on Tango are across several tools. And so we're creating this connective tissue between them. You may not need certain point solutions with very narrow use cases. You may not need those. But what we're hoping for is we're driving adoption of your systems, and we're driving consistency across those systems so that the promise of a particular SaaS application can be realized. I think tech debt, as you describe it, is really just underutilized software. It's not tech debt in the way that like an engineer might think about it, where we've got messy code and things will break.
Yeah. No, I was talking about it very much from a tech bloat perspective, because when we get pulled in, part of what we're doing is looking at what our client or prospective client has as a tech stack today and just re-architecting to make sure that they actually need all the things. And especially if we're implementing a new technology, like a new CRM or whatever, what tools will that replace in the process? So we sort of re-architect the whole thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to do that, obviously. And I love that you guys do a quarterly audit. But I think Tango broadly gives those underlying SaaS applications a better shot at being utilized, right?
Yeah.
You probably bought it at some point for some reason, and you were hoping that it would drive something.
Yeah.
maybe we'll get you a step closer to actually doing that.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the driving adoption piece there too, because, ultimately coming back to the change management piece, which is so critical in the work that we do, implementing, integrating, and then optimizing the systems for our clients. And that's built into our change management training component it's ultimately user adoption. Because if a business is implementing and making an investment in the technology that's going to help them scale better, adoption is the number one metric that they should be measuring against, right? So good. Another good reason to check out Tango.
Absolutely.
Ken, as we sort of wrap up here, anything you want to make sure that you share that maybe we haven't gotten to yet?
Yeah, I'm sure a bunch of people listening to this podcast are right now being inundated with what's happening in AI. It's hard to make sense of the world when every product is claiming AI and the ability to drive, and it's a new name and it's a new company. And you're like, well, I guess that sounds good. Maybe I should look into it. I think there's a big disconnect between like the AI vendors and the customers. I think a lot of these AI vendors that are new to the scene are selling a huge promise. And frankly, a lot of those products under deliver. The way that our approach has been different is we've already done this documentation for thousands of organizations. We've done this digital adoption play with guided walkthroughs. We're sitting on a level of understanding and learnings that allowed us to kind of approach this agent future in a slightly different way. And so what we're saying is, hey, we don't want to be this black box agent running around in your system that you can't audit or you can't verify or validate what it's doing. We actually want to bring you on that journey. And maybe over time we get to that place. But, what our product team is exceptional at is acknowledging what is the underlying user behavior. We talked a lot about entrepreneurial operating system and what's required to really like drive that change in that culture. We think about it very similar when it comes to our end users. What do people really want? Where are we on this like adoption curve? Where are we on trust with AI? And how much of that do we need to build through our product? And so I would highly encourage folks to take a look at what we've built. We're really optimistic about it. I think what you'll find is it's tangible, but it's approachable, and it creates an environment where it's augmenting the human. It's augmenting the person behind the screen. It's not necessarily automating or replacing everything. The last thing I'd say too is, feel free to get in touch with me on LinkedIn. That's primarily where I'm posting and living these days. So get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out directly, ken@tango.us. I'd be happy to show you more.
Awesome. Ken, I'm going to ask you one more question, just sort of wrap up where your mind's at as we wrap up here. So separate from Tango, but just any last words of advice that you would give to any leaders out there that are currently trying to figure out how to scale better?
Scale's tough. I think the foundational thing around scale, we talked about it a bunch, but is really the cultural buy-in. So why are we scaling? Where are we heading towards? Why do we need this? I think what I'm excited about is we're actually entering an age where the primary metric that people are touting is not how many employees we have. It's actually how we've been able to do so much with the amount of employees we've had, right? And so I think folks that are tempted to really scale their organization, make sure you have clear reasons why and rationale and a plan, because I think your existing team is going to be more skeptical than maybe they had been before. Headcount was sort of a nice proxy for how well your company is doing. I don't think it is anymore. I think it's revenue per employee. I think it's doing more with less. I think that's what people care about because they understand that means business viability.
Yeah. I think that's really good advice. But I have to say one thing, so we're essentially in the professional services space. When you look at any drop-down menu of industries, from SaaS through to manufacturing, we fall in the professional services space, which, up until, a year and a half ago was, the only way you can grow a professional services business is by adding headcount. That's no longer the case.
Yeah.
Which is
it's everywhere.
Obviously very, very exciting, but for us, I think every industry, there's just so much opportunity. It's really hard to look out past more than 3 or 4 years, but it sounds like we're both very excited about what's coming.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ken, well, thanks again so much. And I look forward to staying in touch, and maybe we can, meet up when I'm in Chicago or you're in Minneapolis.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Did you enjoy this episode?
Find more at RevOpsChampions.com.